Hi, I'm Fred Weston. I'm here to answer right-wing lies about communism.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communism.
The communists.
The communists.
The communists.
Dedicated to the establishment.
Welcome to the Spectre of Communism. We are back for season 4, and we're very happy to have Fred with us again, who, as you'll know, is a leading member of the Revolutionary Communist International. We had him on last season for our biggest ever episode, answering some of the common questions that are typed into Google about communism. And today we've got him in for a different video. He's going to be responding to some of the propaganda, the lies, the slander spread around online, at political rallies, in the press, by famous right-wingers about communism. First of all, Fred, before we get into it, and we have the clips that Fred will be responding to, so no one can accuse us of not letting these people speak in their own words. Why do you think it is that the ruling class and its agents are so obsessed with communism? Isn't communism supposed to be the music of the distant past?
Well, you would think so by the way they talk about it. I mean, it's amazing. The number of times I've seen communism as a thing of the past. Well, if it were, why do you have to keep declaring its death? And why do you have to keep attacking it and trying to discredit it? I mean, nobody goes around saying, oh, feudalism is a thing of the past and you shouldn't fall for the ideas of feudalism. You don't have to, because everybody knows that it's a system of the past and has no meaning for us today. And yet with communism, which is presented as having failed and could never work, is constantly being attacked. That actually means that the ruling class senses, see, what they sense is this: their system is in deep crisis. And it's not just the basic economic aspects of the crisis. There is a crisis at every level of society. The youth are extremely concerned about their futures. Healthcare is an absolute mess, and nobody can get the care they need. Childcare, for instance, just the care that children require to get a good education, and the number of problems that are growing, the social problems, etc., and no funding is provided for that. The life of ordinary working class people is getting more and more difficult. That is preparing at some point a backlash. And I think the people sitting at the top of this system, the people that benefit the most from it, the rich and the powerful, they sense they're sitting on a volcano which is about to erupt. And what they're trying to do is diffuse, to avoid this eruption from taking place by attacking any kind of idea that offers an alternative to this system. Mm-hmm. That's the main thing. The message is, there is no other system. This is the only one that you can have. This is the best one, actually. One of the videos we're going to look at that comes out, the best possible system you could imagine. We would say that we differ somewhat.
Well, we're going to start with that video. We're beginning with Ben Shapiro, who, as our viewers will almost certainly be aware, is a very popular right-wing American pundit. He's probably most famous for challenging bewildered college students and liberal passers-by to debate, which is basically just berating them and expressing all sorts of bizarre opinions on everything from US imperialism to women's equality. But the particular clip we have is from a speech he delivered to an organization of young conservatives in the US, and Ben Shapiro comes out with a statistic which, if you are an organized communist or socialist, you'll almost certainly have heard before. So let's have a listen.
Obviously, communism bad, also evil, also killed 100 million people. So I'm bewildered by people. I'm bewildered by people who are romantic toward communism. It is a gift of growing up in a one thing that all the communists who live in America have in common is that they live in America. Move to Cuba and then tell me how wonderful communism is without being a part of the prevailing regime. It's easy for Michael Moore to talk about the glories of the Cuban healthcare system while he has his WGA card. It's a little bit different when Michael Moore, would have to live there, which of course he never will. The people who are the most anti-communism in America are people who left communist countries, right, who actually lived in these places. There's such an inherent level of ingratitude in America right now. It's astonishing to me. People who are born on third base and think they hit a triple. People who live in the most prosperous, free, and wonderful country in the history of the world, bar none, not close. If you could be born any time in any place, it would be right here and right now. You're guaranteed basically 8 decades on this earth of health, wealth, and ease. And you're sitting around going, it'd be better if we got rid of everything that undergirds this, and then we do stuff that's fair. And fair means what I like.
All right, well, that was Ben Shapiro. Fred, in the USA today, 8 decades of health, wealth, and ease. Is that a fair assessment of the situation faced by the majority of Americans?
Well, it does if you belong to the people in that conference. Looking at those people, I think they live in a bubble. They live in that part of society which is wealthy, doing well, and ignores the overwhelming majority of the rest of society. He ignores the real class contradictions of a country like the United States, which is very similar to many other capitalist countries. He ignores the uneven division of wealth across society. I've got some figures, and if we look at what happened over the last 35 years, the top 1% has significantly increased its share of overall national wealth. In 1989, their share was 22.8% of national wealth in America. It is now close to 31%. And at the other end of society, the bottom 50%, half of the population of America, in 1989 held 3.5% of total US net worth. Today, that figure has dropped to under 3%. It's 2.8%. So what we're seeing is a shift of wealth from the mass of ordinary working people to the very wealthy at the top. That is the real America. But it ignores what's been happening, for instance, to wages. I have a report here from the Economic Policy Institute, and the title of the article, this was 10 years ago. It says, our country has suffered from rising income inequality and chronically low, slow growth in the living standards of low and moderate income Americans. But what's interesting is the massive increase in the productivity of labor compared to the stagnation in hourly compensation. That's where the big profits come from, i.e. the workers are producing more and more wealth for less money.
And just because he said it, I think it's worth pointing out, in America, a way to ensure that whatever wealth you have is very quickly destroyed, and to guarantee that you don't get 80 years of health and ease, is to actually get sick, is to actually get cancer, is to get a chronic illness, is to get injured at work.
That's right.
Because the absence of socialized healthcare in America means that nearly everybody living there is literally one accident or one situation that they can't control away from having their lives destroyed.
But look at this. This is an interesting figure which refers in particular to the youth that are on this question of health care. Here it says this: recent college graduates have been less and less able to find jobs that provide health insurance. The share of young college graduates who have employer-sponsored health care insurance coverage fell from 61% in 1989 to 31% in 2012, i.e., in a country where you don't have national insurance like in Britain and like in European countries, at least you had jobs that came with some kind of private insurance covered by the contract you had with your employer. It's become more and more difficult to find those kind of jobs, and that explains something. Another statistic. Here's one I found. What happens when you get into debt? And by the way, some of the figures on health, the so-called 80 years of health. Approximately 14 million people, 6% of adults in the United States, owe over $1,000 in medical debt. About 3 million people owe medical debt of more than $10,000. And then it says, what people sacrificed when they had to cover their healthcare costs. It says share of indebted adults who have done the following because of healthcare debt. Top of the list. Cut spending on food, clothing and other basics, 63%. Used up all or most savings, 48%. Taken on extra work, a second job, 40%. And it goes on and on. This is what ordinary people in America have faced with healthcare costs.
And it's funny as well that he makes that specific claim about 80 years and he slanders Cuba, for example. We're not going to talk about Cuba in detail here, perhaps that's for another video, but the average life expectancy in the USA is 77.43 years. The average life expectancy in Cuba is 78.16 years.
Because of the healthcare.
Right,
yes.
So actually you've got a better chance of living for 80 years in Cuba than you have in the USA.
That's right. Now, you see, when you listen to that video, you realize they're ignoring the real America, the real American people, and the real suffering of a large part of the American working class.
And here's an indication of what Americans really think about the state of play in their country. A healthcare CEO, a private healthcare CEO, was shot dead in New York City by a vigilante assassin, and he's become a bipartisan folk hero because people are so angry at the fact that someone is able to make millions profiting from the suffering and from the premature death of countless people.
Yeah, you see, we're talking about this little clip of Ben Shapiro. It's interesting that he actually commented on this event that you just described. Not in this clip. No, he commented on his site, and he was trying to make out that basically it's the lefties, the communists who support Luigi Mangione, and it's us serious, more reasonable right-wing people that
deplore violence in all its forms.
That's right. That's right. But it's interesting to see the number of comments that said people who said, "Well, I'm on the right, but sorry, Ben, on this one you got it wrong."
I saw that. I voted for Trump, but you know what? Screw that guy.
It's not a left-right question. It's a class question. That's what several of them were saying, showing that these people think they're in touch, but they're not really in touch with the real conditions of working people. Now, the fact that literally millions of people expressed some kind of positive opinion about what happened to that CEO reflects the real anger in US society, that they're not are we saying that they're all communists? Is that what we have to conclude?
If only.
Because millions and millions of people are angry about the fact that, and this is not people who don't have medical insurance, extremely poor. These are people who have medical insurance and get denied the cover and then end up either suffering an early death or having to fork out huge amounts of money. And people can see that these companies are profiteering. They're making huge amounts of money at the cost of ordinary working class people. So it's a lie from the very beginning to say that these people are ungrateful for all the great things they have in this country, in this country, the United States, that he's referring to. It's a capitalist country, and all capitalist countries have class divisions in them, with a tiny elite at the top accumulating huge amounts of money, and the mass of ordinary people having to live from paycheck to paycheck.
Well, putting aside the death of one CEO, let's refer to the other big lie he presents, which you will have heard countless times, Fred. I know that I certainly have. This figure, this big, terrifying headline figure, that communism is responsible for the deaths of 100 million people. Now, you may or may not know that that statistic comes from a particular source. It comes from a book called The Black Book of Communism. It was written in France, published in 1997, led in its production by Stéphane Courtois, and it gives a, I quote, rough approximation based on unofficial estimates, that's its words, of 94.36 million people killed as a result of communist regimes since 1917. Now, Fred and I did a little bit of reading around this figure, and we looked at the history of this book, and what we uncovered was a little less than convincing. Is that fair to say, Fred?
Yes. It's a hugely exaggerated figure. It does not correspond to the facts. But why let the facts ruin a good story, as they say in journalism? This has become a kind of slogan that the right wing just throw out. It's just accepted. It's just a fact. The 100 million. That's it. That destroys communism. Any communist who you're responsible for the 100 million deaths. But when you look closer at it, you realize it's actually very, very far from the truth. You see, we also have to look one at one. Who's behind this book?
So the authors were associated with the Paris-based Institute for Social History.
That's right.
Which was actually set up by communists in the 30s, anti-Stalinist communists, but during the 80s it basically ran out of money and it was picked up by right-wingers, especially Jacques Chirac, who was at the time the mayor of Paris. And after that, it had all sorts of connections with the CIA. It was basically
the National Endowment for Democracy.
Exactly, which is, if you don't know, it's an organization that promotes the interests of US imperialism abroad. Basically, it became a front for US, in particular, US propaganda as part of the Cold War. Mm-hmm. So it had an agenda. But not only did it have an agenda, it was primarily written by 4 people. And 3 of them disavowed it before it was even published.
That's right.
And partly that was because Courtois wrote an introduction where he generated this 100 million dead figure. And the other authors said that he used all sorts of dubious methods. He pulled 1 million from here that could be explained by other things. He made up 1 million there altogether. He was so determined to reach this headline figure of 100 million that any semblance of decent research or proper historiography went out the window.
Well, here we found this little gem. Wirth, who's one of the authors, who he independently wrote nearly a third of the book. And then there's Margolin, who's the author of over 160 pages on communism in East Asia. They actually tried to retract their contributions altogether. They were told they couldn't do that for legal reasons, but afterwards they immediately distanced themselves from the book. Yeah. Little detail that's not told when that 100 million is used. They actually accused the editor of being obsessed with arriving at this figure of the 100 million. That was factually incorrect. Now, these are the people who actually wrote a large part of this book, say that. But again, why bother quoting that when you need this great thing, the 100 million?
He was also determined to make a comparison between the actions of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, which is another thing that frustrated his co-authors.
They actually said that the attempt to equate communism and Nazism was unacceptable. The Black Book of Communism was followed a year later by the Black Book of Capitalism, Le Livre Noir du Capitalisme, published in 1998. The book goes into what has happened under capitalism, and in the overall calculations, they actually reach a total of roughly 100 million deaths attributed to capitalism in the 20th century. And they base themselves on facts and figures and all the rest. That book is never quoted because it answers these people in what they're trying to do. But if we're going to apply some of the criteria they use, for instance, famine. There was famine, yes. There was famine that was a consequence of policy, such as the forced collectivizations, which we can go to later on. But if famine is presented as contributing to this famous 100 million, then what should we say about capitalism? How many famines have there been under capitalism. Well, the Irish potato famine, for instance, which was imposed on the Irish consciously by the British imperialists, over 1 million people killed in a small country, or the calculation of 29 million people who died by famine throughout British colonized India.
Which, we should be clear, is higher than even the most outlandish estimates of the number of people who died as a result of the famine in the 1930s that largely affected Ukraine.
But what about the 10 million who died through the atrocities of Belgian imperialism in the Congo, or the ongoing war, the last years in the Congo, where 6 million people have died? And in the Congo, these wars are directly linked to mining essential minerals for today's electronics, etc.
Yes.
Different powers are involved indirectly in grabbing those minerals, and the different militias that are involved, and people are being killed to sustain capitalism. Now, these are facts, right? But why bring in these facts when the whole purpose of this kind of talk is to say, capitalism is a wonderful system. You should be thankful for what it gives you. Communism is terrible. Communism kills. But let's ignore how many people actually die because of the consequences of capitalism.
Well, the logic always appears to be that when people die under regimes that describe themselves as communist or worker states or socialists, it's because of socialism and communism.
That's
but
right.
when people die under capitalist regimes or as a result of capitalist wars, capitalist-imposed poverty, that's not because of capitalism. That's just something that happens, like the weather or a natural disaster.
An inexplicable war, the human nature and all this kind of stuff is brought out. Or these regimes that produce war, without explaining what's behind the war. Right?
Well, what I find remarkable on that point about war is the Black Book of Capitalism. It comes to a figure of 94 million since 1917, using the same timescale as the Black Book of Communism. But that, to me, seems very conservative, because the 2 world wars alone, that's military and civilian deaths, wars that resulted from imperialism, from capitalism, they killed 80 million between them. You've already mentioned the Congolese War. We haven't even talked about the state-sponsored killings of communists and suspected communists under Kissinger's policies, for example. The hundreds of thousands and millions who died in Indonesia, for example. The killings that took place in Latin America under Operation Condor. All of these are crimes of capitalism. When you put them together, then it far outstrips even the most outlandish figure about the crimes committed by so-called communist regimes.
Well, just one thing came to mind, the Argentinian military junta, when they would fly young people and then throw them out of planes.
Yeah.
And they killed tens of thousands of young people. You had the mothers at Plaza de Mayo in Argentina protesting over many years over this question. Argentina, as far as I'm aware, was not a communist regime. It was a capitalist regime backed by the United States. The Pinochet regime, when it came to power, killed thousands.
In Chile.
In Chile, yes. We've had many of these regimes. And when the Spanish Civil War, not to mention, the number of people killed there, the huge numbers. Whenever capitalism has been seriously threatened throughout history, we've seen a brutal response. You mentioned Indonesia. Literally the butchering of the figures that nobody knows the exact figures, but it's in the millions.
I've seen as high as 3 million.
That's right, and the idea was to completely destroy all those people who adhered to the Communist Party in Indonesia. This was a conscious policy and backed by the US. Now this has been going on throughout the history of capitalism. Capitalism is a brutal system of exploitation, but also can carry out some brutal killings when it's necessary to defend its system. But when you're referring to the wars, the First World War, you see, they try to present the Second World War as if it was the war of democracy against dictatorship, against the Nazis and that. But the First World War was a war between, fundamentally, Britain and Germany Why? Because Britain was an established industrial power. Germany was a rising industrial power, growing in its productivity and its competitivity, and they were struggling over markets. And capitalism, we've seen it many times, when the normal laws of competition fail to achieve what you want, they do it through war. And they fought and killed millions of people simply to decide who would dominate the markets of Europe and the world. The Second World War was a continuation of that. And the Second World War alone, 55 million people were killed in that war.
We should be clear, we're talking about the last century or so. Capitalism has been around for far longer than that. And in the time it existed, I mean, Marx talked about capitalism coming onto the world stage, dripping blood and dirt from every pore. When you put together the Atlantic slave trade, when you put together the atrocities you've mentioned, and not even to mention the wars that have taken place in the last couple of decades in Iraq, Afghanistan, the destruction of Yugoslavia, the war that's going on right now in Palestine.
What about the war in the Ukraine?
What about the war in the Ukraine?
Is that a war that's been provoked by communists?
If you ask the liberals, they'll say so.
Yeah, because they seem to have forgotten the history of the last 30 or so years, because as far as I'm aware, Russia is not a communist country. No. It's a capitalist country with a capitalist oligarchy. And it's a war between imperialist powers.
Sure.
And it's a war. I mean, when you say this, they say, oh, how can you say this? It's a war which the United States under Biden consciously wanted because it was a war that they considered could weaken Russia. In their global conflict for markets, because the world is suffering from overproduction and the powers are competing against each other. And Biden thought that he could weaken China by weakening Russia first. The consequences of that has been to push the situation over the limit, and the war broke out. Now, we will see when this war is over how many people have actually been killed, but we know that it's in the hundreds of thousands. That have been killed. And what are they being killed for? They're being killed over who controls the markets.
And we're talking just about direct death through war and atrocities here. We haven't even talked about the impact of poverty and the enforced backwardness of huge swathes of the world. I pulled together some statistics, and we're only being fair here because these are the same methods that the authors of the Black Book of Communism used to condemn our point of view, our ideology. Just to offer an example, 1.4 million people are estimated to die every year from diarrhea as a result of unsafe drinking water. 9 million die annually due to hunger. 1.8 million die from diseases for which vaccines exist, so it's possible that they could have been saved. And it's been estimated by UNICEF that between 2020 and 2030, so in that 10-year period, 52 million children under 5 will die from preventable causes. One thing that you find when you try to actually put a figure on just how deadly capitalism is that the figures rapidly become unmanageable. But you can very easily, and I'll source everything that I'm saying in the description of this video, it's very easy to say that 12 million people die annually as a direct result of avoidable poverty, where there are resources that exist in the world, in the hands of the rich parasites that Ben Shapiro rubs shoulders with, that could be used to save these people's lives and to let them live with dignity, but capitalism denies them. That's social murder, as Engels put it. That's killing them as a result of capitalism.
Well, you know, I did a podcast last week and I quoted some figures about the percentage of people suffering from various cancers who are not getting the care they need now, because of the defunding of the NHS, because of the state that it's in. And I consider that murder.
Yes.
You know, you consciously take a decision not to provide the funding, which will lead to a number of people dying of cancer unnecessarily. That is killing. And that is a classic capitalist killing, i.e. they're dying because the money is not being provided for the healthcare because the money is being sent somewhere else. Yeah. In this case, billions for bombs and planes, tanks, to finance a war, which also kills at the same time. So they kill militarily And then the money that's not directed towards the necessary care leads to the deaths of many ordinary civilian people. This is happening all the time. And it's amazing to watch these people when they talk about the world. And I'm thinking, are they not aware of all this? Now, I think it's worth mentioning is that there were obviously killings under Stalin. There were killings in the gulags, and when Soviet Union collapsed, archive material came out, and there were clearly people were killed, but it's nowhere near the 100 million that they referred to. And secondly, if we go back in history and we look at the first people to die in those gulags, a lot of them were actually communists. Because what is ignored here is that, in effect, the leadership of the Russian Revolution, the overwhelming majority of the Central Committee that led that revolution, were later shot. They were executed. I would argue they were communists. And not just the Central Committee members, many party members who could see that the genuine communism that they had fought for in the revolution was not being carried out. In fact, society was going in a different direction. Because they stood up against that and tried to fight it and maintain the principles of the October Revolution, many of them ended up in the camps, many of them ended up dying either executed in the early days or just dying in the conditions in which they were kept. We consider ourselves, revolutionary communists. We consider ourselves heirs to the ideas of Leon Trotsky, who led an opposition against all this, would argue that genuine communism has not killed these people. That's what we would say. Whereas genuine capitalism, and nobody can question, there is no other form of capitalism, it's the one we live in, kills people every day.
Well, I think we've sufficiently destroyed Mr. Shapiro with facts and logic, so we will move on to another one. And this is quite topical because we've just had the German elections. I've got an interview here that was conducted on X Spaces by Elon Musk, second richest man in the world, head of Doge, turning himself into a bit of a pundit for the far right and a booster of right-wing parties all over the world, and the leader of the AfD, Alternative for Germany, right-wing German party, just became the second biggest party in the German government, Alice Weidel. And they have some things to say about the politics of Adolf Hitler.
I would like to shed some light on the idea, when we talk about Hitler, on the idea of the National Socialists. Back then, during the Third Reich, the National Socialists, as the word says, they were socialists.
Yeah,
Adolf
very
Hitler
much so.
Yeah.
They nationalized industries like crazy.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
He was a communist, and he considered himself as a socialist. And the biggest success after that terrible era in our history was to label Adolf Hitler as right and conservative. He was exactly the opposite. He wasn't a conservative. He wasn't a libertarian. He was a communist, socialist guy.
Okay, there we are. Two of the greatest historians of our age saying that Hitler was a socialist and a communist. Fred, what do we have to say to Mr. Musk and Ms. Weidel?
I tell you, when I listened to that video the first time, I don't know, I just couldn't stop laughing.
Yeah.
I just thought, how ridiculous can anybody be in making such a statement that Hitler was a communist?
I feel like if you'd said that during the Third Reich, he would have had you shot.
Well, he did have people shot, lots of them. The question is this, you see, Hitler, what did he come to power to do? Why was he financed by German capitalists? There's plenty of evidence, there's plenty of records of key industrial figures the Tysons, for instance, and others, providing funding to the Nazi Party.
Yeah, Fritz Tyson, head of the Steel Trust
Yes.
at the time, he wrote a book called, and I'm not joking, I Paid Hitler.
Yes, right. But what did he come to power to do? Well, what did Hitler do with the trade unions, i.e. classic organizations of defense of the conditions of working class people? He smashed them. He arrested the trade unionists and sent huge numbers of them to the concentration camps. If he was a communist, why was it that the first people he went for were the German communists, the members of the German Communist Party, and sent them in their thousands and tens of thousands to the concentration camps? Something like 200,000 were killed by Hitler. If they were communists, surely he should have been, working with them if he was a communist.
Yeah, the very first camp that was established, Nora, established on the 3rd of March 1933, and there were maybe 50,000 prisoners held initially, and it's been estimated by the historian Jane Kaplan that 80% of those were members of the Communist Party.
Exactly.
They were the first priority.
That's right. The others would have been members of the Social Democratic Party and the trade unions.
And Dachau, which was the longest running, the longest serving of the Nazi concentration camps, built 22nd of March 1933, was established initially to intern political opponents. They called it taking them into protective custody.
That's what it was set up for initially.
Communists, Social Democrats, and other political dissidents.
They literally destroyed the most advanced layer of the German working class. Didn't just arrest them or repress them, whatever. They butchered them. And this is what the Nazis did. They came to power to destroy the organized working class of Germany. It was one of the most organized and the most powerful working class movements in Europe. And they, on several occasions, came close to taking power, starting in 1918. They could have transformed Germany. And the final outcome of that 15-year struggle, you could say, from 1918 to 1933, was the rise of Hitler. Now, Hitler and Mussolini both tried to present themselves as somehow socialist. In fact, Hitler, the National Socialists. But Hitler goes to great lengths to make clear what his socialism was. I'll quote from him. Socialism, unlike Marxism, does not repudiate private property. Then he continues, it is patriotic. We might have called ourselves the Liberal Party.
Yeah.
Alice Weidel, maybe you should note that.
Yeah, that was in an interview with an American newspaper, I believe, in 1923.
Yeah, that's Hitler speaking directly. But you see, I looked up some comments on these nationalizations which Musk refers to. They nationalize this and that. Nationalization, per se, is not necessarily a communist measure. Sometimes capitalism nationalizes parts of the economy, especially in times of crisis. Let's quote Mussolini. Mussolini, after the crash of 29, the depression that followed it, and then the banking crisis, in an emergency situation, he nationalized the major banks in Italy. By doing so, he actually boasted once, he ended up by controlling 75% of the companies on the stock exchange in Italy, because the banks, through their different ramifications, controlled so many companies. Now, the reason they nationalized was not to set up some kind of communism. It was to save capitalist companies from collapse and later on reprivatize them. I don't see a destruction of capitalism in Germany after 1933.
They actually reprivatized the vast majority of industries that they nationalized at the beginning of their rule when they were trying to build up the war economy.
The other day, I was reading an article in the Financial Times about the absolute mess that the water companies are in this country today. Thames Water in particular. I've referred to this in other podcasts. But there's an article from Financial Times that actually says it's such a mess that Thames Water should be put into administration. And then it explains what administration means. It says, i.e., temporary nationalisation, i.e. the Financial Times is proposing to nationalise Thames Water.
Yeah, that famous communist organ, the Financial Times.
Is the Financial Times a communist journal because it proposes that? No, it's a journal, a serious journal of the British bourgeois, with the British capitalist class, that realises that you cannot allow the water supply to collapse and millions of people are left without water. Therefore, you've got to intervene to, put the company back on its feet. How would they do that? Nationalise it with public money, set it back up, make it functional, and then, because it's a temporary one, as the Financial Times says, you find a private buyer. So it's a nationalisation to save capitalism. The kind of nationalisations that both Mussolini and Hitler carried out were of this type. I have here something from the National Bureau of Economic Research, a volume they call The Nazi War, Finance and Banking. I think it's from in the 1940s. And it actually says, referring to the economy in Germany under Hitler, it was not socialism or communism. Private property and private profit still existed. It says, an economy in which private property was not expropriated, in which the distribution of national income remained fundamentally unchanged, etc., etc. So, they should do a bit of studying the history before coming out with statements like this, because the question is, the regime came into existence to destroy fundamentally the Communist Party, the trade unions, and the Social Democrats, obviously, i.e. the organised working class. It was financed by the German capitalist class to do that. Another question is, if Hitler was a communist, why did the main emphasis of his war effort direct towards the Soviet Union to destroy what he perceived to be a communist regime? The bulk of the fighting in the Second World War was on that front. And also, what happened to the capitalists? What happened to the German capitalists? Were they destroyed as a class? As far as I'm aware, you still have families today, famous like the Tysons and others, who, in a moment of crisis, financed the Nazis. After the war, of course, they discovered that they were Democrats and democratic, and cleaned up their image and proceeded to run their companies as they always did. They were not eliminated as a class. There was no communism established in at least in West Germany. So it's another attempt. It's a very crude attempt, actually, this one, to tar communists with, you're like Hitler. You're the same as Hitler.
Well, let's dig into that a little bit. The fact that the German industrialists, and this is well known, even in bourgeois history, this isn't something that we've pulled out of our, communist analyses. The German industrialists, the German capitalists, backed Hitler as they regarded the only alternative as communist revolution. They saw sacrificing democracy, basically, and Hitler was fairly open about what he intended to do, as a worthwhile price to pay to protect their profits. There's a book that was written by a Dutch historian, book's called Nazi Billionaires, which investigates how Germany's richest business dynasties made their fortunes by aiding and supporting the Third Reich. Ferdinand Porsche, for example, he convinced Hitler to put the Volkswagen Beetle into production. He volunteered for the SS. So some of these people backed Hitler out of, I suppose, expedience. Some of them became full-throated Nazis. The steel, coal, and arms magnate Friedrich Frick was convicted at Nuremberg for using slave labour. Herbert Klantz had responsibility over battery factories in Berlin, and he ended up acquiring companies that were stolen from Jews because some of the capitalists who were liquidated were Jewish.
Yeah,
as you would imagine.
Because of the anti-Semitism.
He used prisoners of war and forced labourers on his own private estates. I read an article called Hitler's Millionaire Backers, How Germany's Elite Facilitated the Rise of the Nazis, published by the BBC. And it says, I quote, "In 2 to 3 months, the left-wing parties have been broken." That's what Hitler said he would do, and that's what he did. The communists and socialists had disappeared. The trade unions and parliament had been crushed. The wildest dreams of the conservatives had been exceeded. And as German historian Stefan Milanovsky explains, I quote again, "Most members of this power elite underestimated Hitler and saw him as you would see a servant. When questioned about the decision to make Hitler chancellor by another nobleman, Franz von Papen, who was the chancellor in 1932, he was also an aristocrat and a member of the German High Command, famously said, 'But what do you want? We have hired him.'" He was talking to the other capitalists, the other German imperialists. And the article goes on to say, "Many members of the German elites thought that Hitler was going to be the useful idiot who was going to play their games. They thought he could be controlled. And I return to this metaphor of the horseman riding the horse, except within 3 or 4 months they discovered that they were the horse and Hitler was the horseman."
That's right.
So this is the point. The industrialists threw behind Hitler, thinking they could control him, to use him and the movement behind him, this radicalized, reactionary, petty bourgeois and criminal base, these layers of society, these lower middle class in particular layers of society who've been ruined by the Great Depression, ruined by the impact of the Versailles Treaty. They thought that Hitler could mobilize these forces as a battering ram to annihilate the extremely powerful Communist Party. The Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party were enormous. They were a serious threat.
Well, the Communist Party of Germany was the second biggest in the world outside of the Soviet Union itself. It was a very powerful force.
And something we should also say, while it's absolutely true that the earliest inmates of the first concentration camps were political prisoners, it is of course true the vast majority of Hitler's victims and the Nazis' victims were Jews and other ethnic minorities, and the Nazis heavily associated Bolshevism and communism and Marxism with a Jewish plot to undermine Germany.
Yeah, of course, because Marx was Jewish and many of the Russian Bolsheviks were Jewish.
Yeah, Trotsky was Jewish.
They presented it as a kind of communism as being some kind of Jewish plot.
Yeah.
It fitted with their anti-Semitic agenda. I mean, it's a separate question, obviously, but the reason for their anti-Semitism was because of the deep crisis that Germany was in, because as a consequence of the world crisis, capitalism with millions of unemployed, inflation, etc. They had to blame somebody. And just as today, across the world, we're seeing this policy of blame the immigrants for all the ills of society, jobs, prices, etc. In Germany, there was this, let's say, this minority which could be separated out and distinguished as being separate, and you blame them for everything. Instead of accepting that capitalism was the cause of the crisis, not the Jewish people that lived in Germany, they developed this idea. But today's capitalist class talks about anti-Semitism and even uses it against people like Corbyn. But let's not forget that they were the people who promoted the Nazi Party, financed it, backed it, and brought it to power. And it's not as if Hitler hid his views about the Jews. No. In Mein Kampf, there's some disgusting paragraphs where he says he can tell a Jew by the smell of the Jew and all the rest of it. What he was going to do to the Jews was clear.
Yeah, he talked in Mein Kampf about hanging their bodies out until they stank.
Yeah,
he talked about extermination.
And in spite of all that, the German capitalist class financed him, backed him, and brought him to power. Because to them, the most important thing was to have a tool to smash the organized working class of Germany, which was a threat to their interests. If that meant promoting anti-Semitism, a form of racism...
Well, some of them also probably were themselves deeply anti-Semitic. I mean, it wasn't an uncommon prejudice amongst the upper crust.
But it was a thing they were prepared to accept because it was a useful tool to mobilize millions of people. But going back to the question, Hitler was a communist, what we just heard in this video. In February 1933, Goering shouted at an event in the, after the Reichstag was burnt down. He said, these are his words, "Every communist must be shot where he is found. every communist deputy must this very night be strung up. Now, if Hitler was a communist, why didn't Goering have him shot? It's just nonsense. It's just incredible to listen to this. It's just absurd. Ignore the real history, rewrite history in the most absurd manner, like these people do. But I mean, I think it's also part of the leader of the AfD trying to portray themselves as not basing themselves on that Nazi heritage. The truth is, the AfD has within it elements who have a long history of being openly Nazi sympathizers.
Yes.
But so it's a kind of an attempt to clean up your image for electoral purposes, to say we're not like, communists and Nazis, they're all these terrible people, and we're the nicer people here, and look at us. What they're doing is they're defending the interests of the capitalist class today, as they did in the past. That's the essence of all this. It's just that this is an extremely ridiculous statement to make.
And Musk, of course, is doing the same because he is himself a capitalist.
Yes, and he retweets stuff that open Nazis are putting out there.
Yeah.
And occasionally slips into using his arm in a certain way.
Yeah, the Roman salute, I believe it's sometimes described as by the press, euphemistically. It's funny, isn't it, how there was an electron microscope applied to absolutely everything Jeremy Corbyn did, or that kids opposing genocide in Gaza might do in their protests to find any molecule of evidence of anti-Semitism. But the richest man in the world throws out his heart to the crowd in a suspicious manner during a televised address in Washington, and there's a bit of acknowledgement, but not on the same level of condemnation.
No.
Funny how Netanyahu came out and defended Musk for that, actually. He said, Musk is a great friend of Israel.
Yeah, it's just utter nonsense.
Right, well, I think that we've dealt with these idiots well enough, so we're going to move on to our final video from Jordan Peterson, Professor Jordan Peterson, a psychologist at the University of Toronto, who is a bit of an elder statesman now when it comes to spreading reactionary right-wing culture war bile. But here is Jordan Peterson talking about the relationship between Stalin and Lenin.
Lenin was a monster. And if you want to know about that, you can read Solzhenitsyn's writings about Lenin. Because the communist apologists say, well, it wasn't Lenin. Lenin was a good guy. He was all motivated by love of the working class. It's like, well, his henchman was Stalin. And if your henchman is Stalin, you're not a good guy. and Lenin was around during the early collectivization. And if you read what he wrote, you'll find out that he was perfectly willing to have any number of people die as long as his ideological system could be brought into being. So there's no celebrating Lenin. There's no we're cool, young, Marxist, hip revolutionaries, and he's our idol. It's like, there's none of that. Not if you know anything. Not if you're decent.
All right, Fred, well, we spent all of last year during the year of Lenin celebrating history's greatest revolutionary. You're a pretty hip young communist, so what do you think? Has Peterson got a point here? Is Lenin a bad guy?
Well, this is an attempt, like they always do, to amalgamate two men who are very different, Lenin and Stalin, the purpose of which is to blame Lenin for everything that came later. The implicit idea behind all this is that if you try and carry out a socialist revolution, a workers' revolution, you will inevitably end up with a dictatorship and a brutal regime. And his henchman. Stalin was appointed the general secretary of the party, mainly because of his organizational skills. But we have to look at the conditions in which Russia found itself after the revolution. You see, what they can't explain, they try and explain it as some kind of coup. Lenin was the leader of a coup, It's amazing. This guy in exile, for years working against the stream with small forces, nobody backing him, no finance, all the rest of it, just having to depend on the the small sums collected by the rank and file workers and youth who made up the party, and it was, as I said, quite a small force, is able, in October 1917, suddenly to carry out this coup that takes over such a huge country. The truth is, and this has to be said, the reason that Lenin was successful is because the living conditions of the workers, the peasants, were such under the Tsarist regime that by 1917 the conditions for revolution had matured. The February Revolution wasn't carried out by the Bolsheviks. It was a movement that came from below of the masses and challenged the Tsarist regime. And that revolution was not a coup. It was a genuine revolution where millions of workers and peasants participated in an attempt to change society. Now, a discussion like this can't be had, and we can't go into the details of it, without understanding one fundamental idea, that socialism in one country is not possible. Now, I've seen right-wingers say, oh yeah, you always say that, it has to be international. Well, the same applies to capitalism. Capitalism in one country is not possible. Once the productive forces in a capitalist country grow beyond a certain level, the capitalists seek markets outside their country. And if you see the whole history of capitalism, it starts in one country and then spreads from one country after another, Holland, Britain, and then others. And with it comes the imperialism and comes the domination of the whole planet. The whole planet is brought in to the capitalist system. So it's not that, because the simplistic response is, so if it can't work in one country, what kind of a system is it? Well, it's the same to capitalism. Now, Russia was a relatively backward country with a degree of industrialization under the Tsarist regime, and the working class was able to take power, led by the Bolsheviks, in alliance with the peasants, bringing them behind them on the question of land and landlordism. But, you see, when the workers of Russia, through their elected Soviets, and led by the Bolshevik Party and led by Lenin, successfully carried out this revolution, they weren't allowed to then proceed to use the resources, the limited resources of Russia, to start to develop the economy in the direction that workers would desire, i.e., produce what people need. In this particular case, for example, agriculture, which was extremely backward, required a big input of machinery, of the most advanced technology of the time. Russia, because it was a relatively underdeveloped country, had very little industry compared to, say, a country like Britain or Germany, and therefore the advance towards genuine socialism was not possible. But on top of that, they had to redirect all the limited resources they had to fighting in the Civil War. The Civil War was the old landlord class, the Tsarist regime, the generals of that class, reorganizing their white army to destroy the new government. But it wasn't just the white army. It was 21 hostile armies in total. Japan supplied 70,000 troops. Britain, 57,000. The US, France supplied, financing, weaponry, money and arms to strengthen the counter-revolution inside Russia. Germany participated, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Czech Legion of 50,000.
And it didn't go unanswered in those countries. There were big hands-off Russia campaigns conducted in the States, in Britain, through the trade unions, by working people, basically saying, why are we sending our men to crush a state set up by ordinary workers who want to run their own lives and who want peace? The Bolsheviks made huge sacrifices in order to get out of the First World War.
That's right. But it's in these conditions that you see the Bolshevik leadership having to organize all the effort to defeat the counter-revolution. The reason they successfully defeated, and people like Jordan Peterson probably won't accept this, is that when it came to the question of the land was, is the land of the landlords or is it for the peasants? And the white armies were fighting to re-establish landlord control, and the Red Army was fighting for the land to the peasants. That gave enormous strength to the new Bolshevik regime that came to power, to the workers in power, but it cost a huge amount of lives and resources that could have been used. I always say it, instead of building tractors, they had to build weapons. They had to build the guns, the cannons. They had to redirect the limited resources they had to defend themselves against these attacks. And these attacks were carried out by the so-called Western democracies. I wrote an article some years ago, a long article, it's in 4 parts actually. It's called A History of Horror Without End.
We'll include links to this in the description as well.
Capitalism, A History of Horror Without End. And it goes into all the famines and but there's the Irish Easter Rising, how they dealt with that, the massacre of the Paris Commune. But there's one detail. Churchill, this was an article published by The Guardian in 2013, September. The article was Winston Churchill's shocking use of chemical weapons. Now, this is not me. It's not Bolsheviks. It's not Marxists. It's not communists. It's The Guardian.
It's a liberal newspaper in Britain, if you're not aware.
And the article explains that Churchill was determined to use chemical warfare to smash the Bolsheviks in Russia. The troops he sent there, and they did use them. A new chemical weapon had developed that a Major General Charles Foulkes described it as the most effective chemical weapon ever devised. It caused uncontrollable vomiting, the coughing up of blood, and collapse of the victims. Churchill had this used on villages that were controlled by the Bolsheviks during the Civil War. This is the kind of this is the horrendous barbarism that the workers in power faced after 1917 and had to use all the resources and energies to fight them off. It's in these conditions that you have the phenomenon which was called war communism, whereby they had to requisition agricultural produce literally to feed the Red Army and feed the people in the cities. Now, this created a very critical situation. This is not the place to elaborate this in detail, obviously, but clearly it created resentment among the peasants, and it was a policy that could only last for a limited period of time. What's ignored here when they talk about the collectivizations, apart from the fact that it wasn't forced collectivization at that point, it was the requisitioning of the produce. But what is ignored is who was provoking this. It was the foreign powers trying to destroy the Soviet regime and forcing it, obviously, to fight back. And in these conditions, the regime was on the edge. They succeeded in maintaining power because the essential message that the workers and the peasants received from the revolution was, this is our government, and they fought for it. But Lenin, later, Trotsky and the others, Jordan Peterson ignores this. They realized that in the conditions of war, such measures were necessary, but could not continue once the Civil War was won. And if you think about it, I mean, any government at war, even the British government during the Second World War, took special measures to achieve their war efforts. Basically dictating to industry what it should do and what it should produce. Would you call that a forced collectivization of industry? It's nonsense. Once the Civil War was over, that policy was put to one side, and the new economic policy was promoted, i.e., a recognition of the fact that Russia was so underdeveloped that you couldn't fast forward to socialism or communism. You had to develop the economy first. That's one important aspect which he completely ignores as a point. But the other one is on the question of the relationship of Lenin and Stalin.
Yeah, so he refers to Stalin as Lenin's henchman.
Yes, but you see, that doesn't explain certain things. For example, Lenin was aware of the danger of bureaucratism. He actually said at one point, well, famous when you scratch the surface and you find the old Tsarist regime, basically the same bureaucrats. And Lenin actually promoted the idea of an inspectorate to fight bureaucratism. It was called Rabkrin, the Commission of Workers and Peasants Inspection. And he saw it as a guardian of party morality, as a weapon against the state apparatus, against the bureaucracy was emerging. He could see that, and he promoted it. Now, who was at the head of Rabkrin? Stalin. Now, you would think that if Stalin is his henchman, Lenin would be full of praise for Rabkrin. Now, initially, he was. He thought this is a necessary, conscious effort to fight the emerging bureaucracy.
Yeah, I guess at that stage he regarded Stalin as a competent organizer and kind of a tough guy who could be used to weed out any of the layers that were using the party as a route to comfort and a nice career.
That's right. But it didn't take too long. Lenin realized that actually the very same body which had been set up to fight the bureaucracy or the bureaucratism, the bureaucratic tendencies, was itself becoming a tool of the bureaucracy. Now, this actually raises a general point. In the backward conditions of Russia, the rise of the bureaucracy was an objective inevitability once the revolution was isolated. This was an attempt to stop that, but the nature of the society imposed itself, you could say. And this rising bureaucracy, which was rising also above society in terms of material conditions, basically were not interested in the world revolution. They were happy to live, to enjoy the benefits they'd accrued as little bureaucrats. Let's look at what Lenin said. This is in March 1923. He launched a scathing attack in a text called Better Fewer But Better. He says this: let us say frankly that the People's Commissariat of the Workers and Peasants Inspectorate does not at present enjoy the slightest authority. Everybody knows that no other institutions are worse organized than those of our Workers and Peasants Inspection, and that under present conditions nothing can be expected from this People's Commissariat. And yet other scathing remarks. But the point is this: who was at the head of this commissariat? It was Stalin.
And he also says in the same letter, in a way that clearly refers to Stalin, if not in name, let it be said in parentheses, he says in parentheses, that we have bureaucrats in our party offices as well as in other Soviet offices. That was directed at Stalin.
Yes.
And that was partly because they'd already had a clash over Stalin's handling of the situation in Georgia, which we haven't got time to deal with here in detail. Georgia was an oppressed nationality under Tsarist Russia, and there was a huge amount of condescension, of casual discrimination towards Georgians by Greater Russians. And the Georgian communists were in discussion with the Soviet Republic about Georgia's degree of autonomy. And Lenin basically told Stalin to treat the matter very, very carefully, because he knew that if it was mishandled, then it would be regarded as a huge slight, a great insult. And Stalin, long story short, completely bulldozed his way through. He trampled all over their autonomy. He handled the situation very badly. And that's what really made clear to Lenin that Stalin was really a man of the machine. He was a man of the apparatus.
Yeah. Well, you see, it was in this period, in the last period of Lenin's life, that Lenin actually dedicated his attention to the question of the leadership of the party. Now, if Stalin was his henchman, you would think that he would do everything to defend Stalin's position, to promote him, to keep him at the top. And yet we have the famous testament of Lenin which was suppressed for decades inside the Soviet Union and never published, in which Lenin makes an attempt to actually remove Stalin. I have here, in one of his letters from January 1923, remember Lenin was already very ill at this stage.
Yeah, he'd survived an assassination attempt a few years prior, and he had a series of strokes, which meant that he was increasingly isolated from active political life in those last few years.
That's right. But in this is what he says. He dictated this letter to one of his secretaries. He says, Stalin is too rude, and this defect, although quite tolerable in our midst and in dealing among us communists, becomes intolerable in a Secretary General. That is why I suggest, now listen to this, that is why I suggest that the comrades think about a way of removing Stalin from that post, removing Stalin from the post of General Secretary, and appointing another man in his stead, who, in all respects, differs from Comrade Stalin in having only one advantage, namely, that of being more tolerant, more loyal, more polite, and more considerate to the comrades, less capricious, etc. I won't go into the whole detail, but he talks about this is a detail which can assume decisive importance, referring to the conflicts that were emerging in the party. Now, this is Lenin saying he should be removed as General Secretary. How can you then say he was Lenin's henchman? It's true. Lenin saw in Stalin organizational skills, which he clearly had, but he could see he had another side to him that could become dangerous, and did everything he could to have him removed. At one point, he came into conflict because Stalin insulted Lenin's wife. I mean, there was clearly a break taking place between the two. And Lenin even appealed to Trotsky to help him in forming a bloc to go to the Congress on these questions. Lenin, unfortunately, died early. And in the last months of his life, a lot of facts were kept from him consciously by Stalin, as Stalin was strengthening his grip on the bureaucracy.
We should also say that Stalin controlled Lenin's doctors for the period where he was most ill. And if you read the two-part biography of Lenin that we released last year, written by Rob Sewell and Alan Woods, which I recommend you do, it's excellent, they point out that Stalin actually had means, motive, and opportunity to silence Lenin. We can't prove anything, of course, but it was certainly convenient that Lenin died when he did.
That's right. He died when he did, and that was a convenient thing for Stalin because he could then present himself, as he was still the General Secretary and had the apparatus in his hands, as the heir to Lenin. He was continuing in the traditions of Lenin and present that myth in the coming decades.
A myth that Jordan Peterson here accepts 100%.
That's right. Now, and the reason for this is this. There is a huge difference between Lenin and Stalin. We don't have, volumes and volumes of the collected works of Stalin that we could suggest you read. There's some things that he wrote which were of interest, for instance, on the national question, but he was in no way a theoretician or a leader like Lenin was. Without Lenin, the Bolshevik Party would have been lost in 1917. Without Stalin, it wouldn't have made a fundamental difference. Stalin was a leading figure at a certain level, and he had certain skills. But I think even Trotsky, once said that if Stalin in that period, in the early period, had been shown what he would become like, he himself would have been shocked. He wasn't consciously working towards that. He was actually a product of the degeneration of the system, began to personify the bureaucracy and gave it an expression. But that was not the heritage of Lenin. Lenin fought, if you read State and Revolution, the state that Lenin was fighting for was a state where all officials were elected with the right of recall, all officials to earn no higher than the wage of a skilled worker. These are the demands that Lenin listed in what should be the basic elements of a democratic worker state, not the imposition of a bureaucracy over the working class. There's a huge difference between Lenin and Stalin. But the purpose of these kind of videos is not to discuss real history, not to discuss the real facts, but just it's the same as the 100 million dead or Hitler was a communist. It's to throw as much mud at communism as possible, with the idea that some of it will stick, and we dirty the image of communism in an attempt to stop people looking towards the ideas of genuine communism in a period where capitalism is in deep crisis. We listed earlier on, all the deaths that are caused by capitalism, the healthcare situation in America, and the wars that take place. But there is a general crisis of the system. It's in a period of senile decay, this system. And the people at the top, the ruling class, have every interest in trying to denigrate the ideas of genuine Marxism, of genuine revolutionary communism, present them as something which they are not, in order to frighten people away, divert people's attention away from it, and then prettify the system they are ruling over and present it, like Ben Shapiro did in that first video, as the best thing you could possibly ever imagine. A wonderful system that this capitalist system is, and can't understand why people are looking for an alternative. The reason is, and I'll say this to all of these people that we listen to, the working class is suffering. Its conditions are worsening day by day. The pressure is constant. Wages do not hold up to inflation. The cost of living crisis. Inflation is taking off again. We can see it. It's 3% in Britain, and they reckon it could be 4% by the end of the year, on top of what we already have. People are struggling with the daily life is a struggle. The healthcare is a problem. People are struggling with the cost of living. Then they struggle with the need for health, the healthcare needs they might have, and sometimes having to pay for it and can't afford it. And the conditions that the young people are living in, housing, jobs, working conditions, hours, etc. This society is offering very little to the huge majority of the population, in particular the youth. And that means that people will be looking for an alternative to this system. They understand this system doesn't work. There's something wrong with it. We need to look for an alternative. We say the only other way of running society is to nationalize, to go back to what they were saying, but nationalize not in order to save capitalism from itself. Nationalize the commanding heights of the economy, the main companies, in order to take over the resources and run them democratically under the control of the working people themselves, the workers that produce the wealth, and decide what we do with those resources, i.e., not spend billions on building weapons to destroy and kill, but invest that money in healthcare, in education, in cheap housing, which is possible. The wealth is there, but as we said right at the beginning, it's being concentrated ever more in the hands of the 1%. What we say is that wealth should be in the hands of the 99%. You achieve that, then we can start to solve all the problems of society.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Fred. I think we'll have to leave it there, even though we have plenty more right-wing idiots and slanderers to respond to. I think we might have to do another episode where we deal with a few other popular right-wing commentators. But just to reiterate what Fred said, there is an alternative. A better world is possible. A better system is possible. And if you agree with what you're hearing, then we are not just a YouTube show, not just a podcast. We are the podcast of the Revolutionary Communist International, with a presence all over the world. Get in touch. Links are in the description to where you can find your nearest national section and find out more about how you can take the fight to the capitalists and their cronies. And we're back now every single week with a new topic, a new theory, a new subject to discuss, a new period of history to discuss. Don't forget that we also have our sister show where Fred is a regular contributor, Against the Stream, which is a rolling analysis of the very dramatic and often unpredictable events taking place in world politics from a communist perspective. That comes out every single Thursday and we'll be releasing every single Tuesday. So you've got 2 podcasts to look forward to in the coming weeks and months. For now, I've been Joe Attard, and Fred, one more time, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me again.
And I'll see you all next week.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communism. The communists. The communists. The communists.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what is communism?
I'll guarantee that 10 minutes from now, a lot of you are going to have a new understanding of communism.